The cash-strapped government of Ontario has announced a new plan to raise money for provincial infrastructure projects. The plan will affect beer sales in Ontario, as well as the province's electrical utility. Ontario says the plan will raise about $4 billion to fund new infrastructure, including transit. It will sell off a majority stake in the province's electricity transmission business, Hydro One. Big changes are coming for Ontario beer drinkers, too. Up to 450 grocery stores across the province will be allowed to sell beer. The foreign-owned beer store, a near monopoly, will be required to cut prices for beer sales to restaurants and bars and give more shelf space to small Ontario brewers. But a new tax will apply to all beer sold in Ontario, expected to raise $100 million a year. Premier Kathleen Wynne acknowledged that Ontario has a troubled history when it comes to selling public assets, citing the privatization of the 407 highway by the provincial government in 1998.
The 407 debacle has made all of us, governments, media, and the public alike, timid and skeptical around the subject of asset review. And I understand that, and I'm okay with that. We should always question big decisions. It's very important that we do that. But in that same vein, we have to question the status quo too. We absolutely have to be willing to change.
Ed Clark is chair of the Premier's Advisory Council on Government Assets. When we spoke earlier, I asked him why he believes selling a majority stake in Hydro One is a good decision for Ontario.
Oh, I think it's a very good decision for Ontario because it kind of gets you the best of both worlds. I think the key thing that it does is it frees up capital, about $4 billion, that can be reinvested in infrastructure. It's not like the infrastructure in Hydro One goes away, it stays in place. But now we can solve what is the core, I think, issue in Ontario is an underinvestment in transit and transportation infrastructure, which I believe is essential to have that investment in place to keep the economy from growing. And we do that while at the same time, I think, meeting the public policy concerns that people have when you bring in private sector capital into a company like Hydro One.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because people often have an almost visceral reaction to the idea of public assets being sold off. How do you respond to criticism that it's short-sighted?
Well, because I think in a sense it's how they were sold off was the issue. And so I think what makes it different than what we're doing here is we're selling it off in stages, so we make sure that we really do get the best value. At the same time, the government's going to continue to own 40% of it. But the critical thing that I think people, if you don't look at the issue, you're not necessarily aware, is that people don't understand that Hydro One today does not set its rates, that the rate that the electricity payer pays, and in the future will not set those rates. They are set by the Ontario Energy Board. So if you contrast that with selling off 407, they sold it all at once and they didn't put any rates control on it. So in fact, the private sector was allowed to charge whatever they want. That will not be the case. We'll sell this off in stages, and the OEB, the Ontario Energy Board, will continue to determine the rates that Ontarians will be charged.
So
if I can just finish, I believe that by getting in the private sector and putting in private sector discipline, in fact, it will have a favorable impact on rates, not an upward pressure on rates.
There are going to be a lot of people listening to this who are going to hope you're right. Explain to me then how that would work. So if you have a situation in which shareholders are saying we must raise rates to have a viable business model, and they're pressuring the management, and management goes to the Ontario Energy Board, what happens?
Well, if they're not justified cost increase, the OEB says no. And they've done that. Actually, they did that for Ontario Power Corporation recently, and they did that for Hydro One. Just their recent rate application, they denied some of the costs and said, we're not going to let you put that on the ratepayers. So the way it works is that right now, Hydro One, for its transmission, has agreed to rates for the next 2 years on its transmission, and agreed to rates on distribution for 3 years. If management goes out and finds cost savings, then in fact those initially do fall to the shareholders. That's a good thing because they're incented to find them. But at the end of that period, when they go back to the OEB, what the OEB is going to say, you found those cost savings, we want the ratepayers to get the benefits. That's why I think there will be a favorable impact, because we have a system that incentivizes management to find the cost savings, but in the end, those cost savings all end up to the benefit of the ratepayers.
Yeah, I guess, although critics might be concerned when you talk about cost savings that you typically see with these sorts of asset sales of public facilities, it comes down to labor. What's this going to mean for employees of the companies?
Well, there's no question in any organization, if you're going to try to save costs, you have to find ways. You often end up saving the amount of people you need to do an operation. That's called productivity. That's a good thing if it makes the consumer better off. No doubt we have very good labor agreements. You should know that the Power Worker Union has actually endorsed this proposal. So we're able to work our way through these issues. And clearly when you do that, you have to treat the workers fairly. And good organizations know that you have to have your employees on side if you're going to serve the customer better, and I think they will do that.
What kind of interest has been expressed so far, especially from outside the country? One of the reports I read said, for example, that Berkshire Hathaway is interested.
Yes, but we're not going to allow someone to take a large share. So one of the things that we're doing here is limiting any one investor to 10% in this company. What we really want to create is a great growth company anchored in Ontario. Canada needs big companies that are strong and can grow and create jobs. You know, it's interesting, these companies, both OPG and Hydro One, trapped in public ownership, actually have their employment decline every year. They're not growing because they can't grow under the umbrella that they have now. I think by freeing it in and bringing in private capital, this can be a great growth engine for Ontario. We've required that its headquarters and the strategic decision has to stay in Ontario, and that it has to be widely held, so someone can't get control of this company. And it has to stay that way in the future.
What do you say to people who see this as kind of the thin edge of the wedge? So we've sold this much, and now it's going to be easy for the next government to sell a little more and a little more until the province no longer holds the asset.
Well, you know, it's hard to say. You can't bind future governments. So this government is binding itself and saying we can't do that. We'd have to go back in the legislature and change the law in order to do that. That's all you can do in the circumstances. I think what's important is that we've got this company with the right governance, that it will serve in the public interest. I think it will be positive for ratepayers, and it'll be a growth engine, and particularly given that the government is using the money for the right thing to invest in things that have a high rate of return for the province. That's what we're trying to accomplish.